Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a real head-scratcher, a 490-year puzzle from the ancient world. And what's wild is that this one single prophecy has created two completely different visions for our world, one that's already in the history books, and another that points to a future that, well, hasn't happened yet.
So, how is that even possible, right? How can one ancient prophecy lead to two totally different futures? Well, that's the central mystery of Daniel chapter 9. We're going to break down how this one prediction, this 490-year period, is understood by two major world religions in ways that are, well, they couldn't be more different.
All right, first things first. To really get this prophecy, we have to go back to the beginning, to the guy who received it in the first place. You see, this whole vision, this entire thing, was an answer to a prayer. And it wasn't just any prayer. It was a prayer born out of absolute terror.
So, picture this. The prophet Daniel is living in exile in Babylon. He's reading the scrolls of an older prophet, a guy named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah had made this incredible promise from God. After 70 years of Babylonian rule, the Jewish people would finally get to go home.
Okay, this is where Daniel's mind starts racing. Let's walk through his thought process step by step. First, he reads Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy. Then he watches the Babylonian Empire, this huge superpower, actually fall, just like Jeremiah said. But then, crickets. The Jews aren't going home. The second half of the promise just isn't happening. And you can imagine, this is where he starts to freak out.
He starts thinking about the worst-case scenario, and his mind lands on this one number, 490. See, he remembers this old curse from the book of Leviticus that said if the people kept messing up, their punishment could get multiplied by 7. So he does the terrifying math in his head. 70 years times 7 equals 490 years. A nearly 500-year exile. Horrifying.
And this is the key, you guys. You have to get this part. The whole famous prophecy we're about to deconstruct is a direct answer to this specific prayer. Daniel is on his knees, begging God, please, please don't let it be 490 years. He's terrified that his miscalculation is actually the new reality.
So what happens next? How does God respond? Well, this brings us to our first framework. The traditional Jewish understanding is that the angel who shows up isn't giving some brand new mystical prediction. No, he's there to correct Daniel's math. In this view, the 490 years are a solid, continuous block of time. The angel is basically saying, Daniel, you've got the number right, but your starting point is all wrong. The clock didn't start now. It started way back when the first temple was destroyed. And you know when it ends? Exactly 490 years later with the destruction of the second temple by the Romans. And what's really interesting is that all the key players mentioned in the prophecy, they're real historical figures from that era. The anointed king is Cyrus the Great. He's even called anointed elsewhere in the Bible. The anointed one who gets cut off, that's King Agrippa II, the last king of Judea. And the coming monarch who destroys the city, that's the Roman general Titus. It all fits perfectly like puzzle pieces into that 490-year window. Okay, now let's switch gears completely. We're moving on to framework number 2, the popular Christian interpretation. And this one takes those exact same verses and charts a totally different path for history. Right off the bat, this interpretation kind of moves past Daniel's personal panic about the 70 years. Instead, it picks a completely different starting point, a decree from King Artaxerxes, almost a century and a half after Daniel's prayer. Now, why that specific decree? Because if you start the clock there, the timeline points right to Jesus. And the timeline itself is constructed in a totally different way. It's not a continuous 490 years. Instead, it runs for 483 years, which lands right on Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But then, the clock stops. A huge gap of almost 2,000 years, and counting, is inserted. This is often called the church age. And after that long pause, there's a final 7-year period, the tribulation, that's still to come. So, in this framework, the key figures become theological. Messiah the Prince is, of course, Jesus Christ. The Messiah who is cut off represents the crucifixion. And that prince that shall come, he's not Titus, the Roman general from the past. He's a future figure, a great villain known as the Antichrist. Okay, so let's just pause here for a second. How in the world do we get two completely different visions of history from the exact same text? It's a huge divide. And the answer, it turns out, isn't just about the words on the page. It's about how you decide to read them.
Yeah, this chart really lays it all out. You can see the pattern, right? The Jewish framework treats the whole thing as a correction to Daniel's prayer, and it all stays neatly within his historical world. But the Christian framework sees it as a long-range prediction. And to make that work, it needs a different starting point, a timeline with a giant pause button, and it pulls in a key antagonist from a completely different part of the Bible.
Now, the sources we're looking at today make a pretty bold claim. They argue that for the messianic timeline to work out mathematically and thematically, you actually have to make some, let's say, torturous changes to the text. Here's a prime example of what they mean. Look at Daniel 9, verse 26. The original Hebrew pretty clearly says an anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. Simple as that. But if you pick up something like the King James Version, you'll see an extra phrase added in there, but not for himself. Now, that phrase is a huge deal for Christian theology. It points to an atoning death. But the thing is, it's just not there in the original Hebrew.
And that's not all. This framework also relies on a few really big assumptions that aren't actually mentioned in the book of Daniel. You've got that massive 2,000-year gap, the church age, just dropped into the middle of the timeline. You have to use a special 360-day prophetic year to make the math line up, and of course, the whole idea of a future Antichrist is imported from the New Testament. And this leads to a pretty crucial historical point that these sources bring up. They argue that this whole interpretation was actually a later Christian invention. You can't find this specific timeline calculation, the one that starts with Artaxerxes and points to Jesus, in any of the first-century Christian writings. Not in the Gospels, not in Paul's letters, nowhere. That suggests the earliest Christians just didn't see it this way.
So let's step back. Why does any of this matter? What's the big takeaway here? Well, it's a fascinating case study in the power of interpretation. It shows how the lens you bring to a text can completely change what you find inside it. Really, the core difference boils down to something scholars call hermeneutics. It's just a fancy word for your method of interpretation. Framework 1 prioritizes the text's original context, what it meant to Daniel right then and there. Framework 2 prioritizes a later theological belief system and then reads the text through that lens, looking for confirmation.
To put it as simply as possible, one method starts with Daniel's question. The other starts with Jesus as the answer.
And that really leaves us with a big provocative question, doesn't it? When we read anything, whether it's an ancient prophecy or an article from this morning, how much does our starting point determine our final destination? How much do the answers we already have in our heads shape the questions we're willing to ask? It's something to think about.